I am pleased to introduce, for this week's first installment of the Border Chronicle audio, Amy Juan, who will share her profound perspective of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands from the point of view of people who were here long before the border existed, the Tohono O'odham. Amy works for the International Indian Treaty Council and is a longtime cultural activist who grew up in Newfield on the Tohono O'odham Nation. The United States imposed that boundary in the mid-19th century with no consultation of the O'odham people. Although the Tohono O'odham Nation is located in southern Arizona and the size of the state of Connecticut, O'odham lands reach deep into Mexico. As Amy will say, and she was born in the 1980s, she comes from the last generation to experience freedom of movement before the Border Patrol occupied their land. In the late 1990s, but particularly in the post 9/11 era, the Border Patrol imposed itself with checkpoints on every paved road out of the nation, with forward operating bases with armed agents, and with surveillance systems. And aside, at one point, Amy discusses her trip to Israel and Palestine, and she was going to see where towers, integrated fixed towers, were first constructed in Palestine by an Israeli company before being constructed on O'odham land. I have known Amy for nearly a decade, first because of her activism fighting this Border Patrol presence, and since then I have come to know her as an educator and, dare I say, a visionary. Please enjoy. Well, Amy Juan,
Yes.
Thank you very much for being here with me.
Mm-hmm.
This is, in fact, the first audio interview of the Border Chronicle, so I'm very honored to be in your presence for this.
I'm honored to be the first.
That's great. We're talking here from an office in Tucson, Arizona, and I guess I wanted to start out by asking you about the border, and just hear about your experience with the border, where you're from.
Well, if I can introduce myself first in all
Sure.
of them. Anya Jigig Amy Juan, Jakomai Amjit, Wachich Isaac Amjit, Donna Autumn, Hajuidiga, Junior Alga, Jijig Grimelda McGill, Sylvester Juan, and Yagak Junior Wask of Jijig, Mary Melissa Miles, but Daniel Juan, but and Yahoo Junior Bob of Jijig, Mary Elizabeth McGill, but Lawrence McGill, but my name's Amy Juan, and I come from Komobabi community, but also Wichich, which is Newfield's community on the Tohono O'odham Nation. For the most part, I spent a lot of time in my childhood growing up there in Newfields with my dad's family. My grandpa, my family down there, our roots come from a community called Judeguahia or Poza Verde, and it's a community on the other side of the so-called border now, in one of the traditional communities that we still have. I like to share that, when growing up down there in Newfields, we didn't really know what a border was. We didn't know that it existed as a lot of people understand it to be, that it's a line between two countries. When I was growing up, it was just a barbed wire fence. I just have good memories about it. Good memories in that area of, being with my family, my cousins in the back of my grandpa's pickup truck, and at the border, at the gate, as a lot of O'odham call it, or in O'odham we would call it Gorikijit. It was a meeting place, and it was a place for O'odham on both sides of the line to trade. And so the O'odham to the south, they would bring vegetables and fruits and coffee and liquor and food, in general. So when I would be with my grandpa, he'd be at the end of the day after doing his ranch work, he would take us there and we would get, just like a little treat. And it was just, it was fun. And I never felt in danger. I never felt like it was a place that we shouldn't be. It was just the opposite. It was home. And so I'm 35. Growing up, I think I would say we started to see changes when I was about 7. We were being told to be careful. I remember that that our aunts and our uncles would start to tell us, to stay close, but we didn't understand why. We didn't really know what the changes were in the beginning. But at that time was when we started to see a lot of people traveling through the nation, migrants, travelers. But it wasn't something that I saw. Now I understand that that's what was happening at the time. And then later on, we started to see drugs and just different things, other things, and it started to become more dangerous. And a little before I was born, my grandmother, Mary Miles, her second husband, his name was Glenn Miles, and he was one of the first O'odham U.S. Customs agents, one of the first members of the Shadow Wolves. And, Glenn had already been an agent for a while when he met my grandma, and they were married for about a year before he was murdered down at the border. So he was patrolling in the area, and he got a call. And, it's not like it is now. There weren't any Border Patrol agents out there. I think there was only a handful of agents that were patrolling the whole border at the time, and they were all O'odham. And the story that I was told growing up was that by the time his partners got to him, he was already shot in the assassination style in the back of the head. So my grandma had a lot of I would say memorabilia that I like to look through growing up, because he was considered the first casualty of the border. And she had a lot of pictures and cards from different agencies throughout the country. And so just kind of hearing those stories about what happened to Glenn, and he had passed away actually in February of 1986, and I was born in April of 1986. So I was on the way, going ahead to when we started to see changes. What had happened to my other grandpa. He lived by himself. He was a cowboy. And some smugglers had broken into his house, and they stole his truck. I remember it was around Christmas because, my aunties were telling us, Grandpa's not able to buy you gifts this year. It was, something that happened. And my cousin, she had a dream that something happened to my grandpa, and she wanted my uncles to go check on him. And when they got to his house, he was tied up in his bed, and they had also even shot at his head, and they missed, but thankfully they didn't check, to see if they missed or not. So that was how they found him. And after that was when, people started to get scared, and the community there, Newfields, they actually began to patrol the area on their own. And I remember the men and different families in the community would take turns each night.
Was the community right on the border?
Yes. Yeah, it's the last community on the border. It's not even a mile away from the border. But I like to think about it because I like to remember that were able to protect our own communities before Border Patrol came in the way that it did. But because there was so much traffic at the time across back and forth across the border, um, the Dawn of the Nation government created the Rangers, and so it was the Rangers, and then after that, seeing more Border Patrol. And I remember that it was a big deal because my little brother at the time was just little. He was probably about 2 or 3, and him beginning to recognize the Border Patrol vehicles and call them out, like as a kid, like just recognizing the green and white, and he used to call it border control, as a little kid, and it just felt, and even though I was small at the time, um, I remember feeling um, watched. I guess you would say that was the biggest thing, was like not having that sense of freedom. I would say between the ages of 10 to when I was in high school, was just seeing like year after year more and more Border Patrol, the checkpoints going up, when I was when about the time when I graduated high school, and then but also seeing like what was happening in the community, which was a lot of my family and my community basically get caught up in the business of trafficking. And I think that's something that not a lot of people talk about, because it is um, um, a harsh truth, and it is a symptom of what was happening at the time, which now that I'm older and I understand that in around that time, the early 90s, was when NAFTA was enacted. There was a lot of different things that were happening in Mexico that I don't think a lot of people um, were aware of, and also not realizing that the border was being secured from both sides of us in California and Texas, and um, not really understanding what um, um, Homeland Security or Border Patrol was doing strategically at the time to um, funnel traffic through our area. And growing up, it wasn't something that was bad. There were I always understood that people who were traveling through our area, they it wasn't a bad thing. It was actually a resting place. It was a place where people would rest with families for a while. They would even work to help build houses or do ranch work or what have you, and then they would move on. And it was always there was a reciprocity, from us, the O'odham, who knew, that what it was like to travel through the desert, and then the people who are coming through that had respect, like, hey, these are the Indios, and this is their area, and this was just, there were some partnerships and things going on there, and I think in some funny ways, like that partnership, like continued, but it morphed into something else with what was happening, or what began to happen with a lot of the smuggling and human trafficking and things like that. And so I guess I see what's happening from a lot of different angles. And I think a lot of people have to understand that, like, it's not black and white. It's we're humans, humans, and our history and just the way that we move to, especially to survive. I think the border is a hot spot for that, for a lot of different reasons. But when I was in high school, I started to see that the way that Border Patrol, the way that they, how did I say that, the way that they acted in the community began to change, where it was not there to be helpful anymore. It was there to be controlling. And
And this was the early 1990s.
Yeah,
correct?
it was the early 90s. But it wasn't like it was a happy thing, like, oh yeah, Border Patrol's here. But it was like, okay, they're here. They're here to help with these things. Excuse me, these things that were happening. But like I said, I see that they turned against us. They turned against the community where the community was suspect. The communities were the ones being under surveillance and being checked, and that was when the checkpoint started to go up. At first, that was actually on the res. It was actually in Shipbuck district near Crow Hang community. It's now off the nation, but it's at the boundary. But before that, it was on the res, and I'm glad they moved it. But it was really it was actually in the community. But pretty soon we started to see a lot of harassment. The scariest was when Bennett Patricio was run over. He was 18 at the time, walking home to his community in Cowlick, was hit and run over by a Border Patrol agent, and died. And his family was harassed a lot by Border Patrol, and a lot of the community. A lot of the community believes that Border Patrol is basically doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and that he saw something, and that's why he was killed. And again, like, nothing ever came out of it. His the agent who went to trial was set free. It wasn't like he was just hit once and that was it. It was his body was run over a couple of times. And his family, his mom, did a lot of interviews, saying that they would find their tires slashed, or they would just different things that were happening to them, to the point where they actually moved off the res into another state for a while, because there was just a lot of things that were happening to them following his death. For me, what really got me involved around 2006, while I was attending Tohono O'odham Community College, there was an elder from my district, from San Pedro community, which is the last community before you hit the eastern boundary to Tucson. There's an elder there who went through the checkpoint, and she refused to roll her window down the whole way. And they when they finally got her to roll it down, they basically just pulled her out of her vehicle, cut her out of her seatbelt, just manhandled her. And the local newspaper, the runner, they interviewed her about her experience. They took pictures that they didn't publish in the paper, but they did show to us, and her arms were bruised. This is that elder. And so for us young people who had already seen all these things happen that I had shared earlier, I think, for us, that was like the last straw. Like, okay, somebody needs to say something. We need to stand up for ourselves, because it's getting too much. There's a lot. We started to organize ourselves and really ask, like, what are our rights when we're dealing with Border Patrol, because nobody had ever told us or asked. So we just started to ask ourselves and do research and talk to our Attorney General of the nation, talk to people at ACLU here in Tucson, and ask, what are our rights when we're dealing with Border Patrol. Started to have presentations in the community to share that with people. A lot of people would show up. We're wanting to, most of all, like, empower people, when you go through the checkpoint, that you can say no. These are the things you can say no to. but not even just on the checkpoint, like on the nation with roving patrols. Like just because your vehicle is dusty doesn't mean they have probable cause. Like we have a lot of dirt roads out there, and also defining that for people. What is probable cause? What is reasonable suspicion? All that stuff. I do feel that what we began to do at the time with educating people was really helpful because people started to assert themselves, especially at the checkpoints. And you could definitely see the change in the attitude of agents too when we would go through the checkpoint, where they would treat us like we didn't know shit, to where they were careful. They were a little bit more careful. And people started to like get, smart and like I guess just not be scared anymore. I like thinking about my uncle. He was telling us about going through the checkpoint, and he said, because their question is, "Are you a U.S. citizen?" And so when he went through, they asked him, "Sir, are you a U.S. citizen?" And he just laughed and he said, "The first ones," and then they got to laugh and they let him go. Or others who started to say, if they asked, "Are you a U.S. citizen?" and they said, "Oh, I'm O'odham." And so they would, let them go. But eventually the agents started to ask, "Well, are you a U.S. O'odham or a Mexican O'odham?" And, that pissed a lot of people off because we're O'odham, on both sides of the line, we're O'odham. But then, that also started to define who was who. And that also, brings to attention that O'odham are treated differently if you're O'odham in the U.S. or you're O'odham in Mexico. And so for O'odham in Mexico, basically when the checkpoints went up, they couldn't leave the res. They were just, if they went through the checkpoints, they were treated like illegal.
Could you explain, like, is there quite a few people that live in Mexico, O'odham that live in Mexico, and that there's a freedom of movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I would say up until the early 90s, we had our traditional crossings were still open. So the Tohono O'odham Nation shares 75 miles of international border with Mexico and the U.S. And we had 3 main traditional crossings from the west to the east that we would cross. Families, like I said, were able to cross back and forth by vehicle or on foot or what have you. And the area that I'm most familiar with is the gate, or Gorgijic and San Miguel, or what people know as the San Miguel Gate. And on the Mexico side of the line, we still have 9 traditional communities. And so when the line was drawn, it did divide the people in half. They're not just the people, but a lot of things. And I think one of the main impacts has been culture, the language, the songs, the ceremonies, the dances. What was done on the Mexico side of the line stayed, but it wasn't more known on the U.S. side, and vice versa. Like as far as ceremonies and things like that, because it did affect how people were able to move back and forth for those ceremonies and gatherings and things like that. 5 to 8 years ago, those traditional crossings began to be closed. Some by Border Patrol or Department of Homeland Security. There's 2 to the west that Border Patrol, they're gated and they're closed and they have the keys. But the checkpoint, the crossing at San Miguel Gate, that was closed by a Mexican ranching family to the south. And there's a lot of land grabs. There's a lot of political things that are around all of that because O'odham, historically we've always occupied those lands, but we also didn't have access to the official documents like land deeds and things like that because a lot of indigenous people in Mexico don't really have access or rights to those things like Mexican citizens. Before that, there was transportation for members in Mexico to come to the U.S. to take care of their business, to get water, even to get groceries and things like that, or even to go to school for the younger of them. But a lot of that changed when they shut down the Autumn in Mexico office, and I think the nation probably just felt a lot of pressure from the U.S. government because they were cracking down on border security to not do those things anymore, and so it did put a lot of hardship on the people in Mexico, just for their survival.
Did they stop crossing freely?
Yes and no. It definitely became more challenging to do that. So what used to take about 20 minutes to get from Newfeltz to Jalaguaya through our crossing and through the dirt roads, now it takes about 2.5 hours to get from Newfeltz or the nation around through Sassabee and then heading back west to those communities. But we still do it, and we also still cross for ceremonial purposes. Just even this past year, I've been involved with 3 runs that we've done along the border and back and forth across the border. And that's our way of maintaining our presence because, that's something that I've heard from elders who aren't here anymore, telling us that, that's our job, is to have a presence on both sides of the line, to have a presence going back and forth, because as soon as we stop, they're going to say, oh no, you don't have that right because you're not asserting it or because you don't do that anymore. And
didn't you say on the last generation to see the nation without such a huge presence of border patrol? Because when you look at it just from a budgetary standpoint, if you look at the early 1990s, like they had a $1.5 billion budget for border and immigration enforcement, and then you go to like now, like it's $25 billion for 2021. You could see this astronomical just increase of budget, and I think that's what it seems like. You're showing like how this manifests on the nation.
Yeah, people who are my age, around 35, grew up in the 80s and early 90s. Yeah, we're the last ones to remember what it was like to move freely. Where Res Kids is something that I talk about. It's like just being able to go outside and play and be gone all day, and be exploring. And that changed for my younger cousins. We started to stay closer to home. I didn't realize how big of an impact historically and like generationally it had until my nieces were born, because I began to see that every time we got to the checkpoint, like just their whole demeanor and their attitude changed, from being, happy little girls to being scared, and already knowing that when you approach the checkpoint to be quiet, to sit still, that attitude. And I was like, wow, like, to like already at that age be used to that, already having that change, already that change in demeanor, understanding that you're gonna be questioned, you're gonna be searched, you need to be on your best behavior, or else something might happen. And there was instances where families, I talked earlier about the elder, but there was also a instance where there was an undercover shadow wolf in his family, and they were going through the checkpoint, and they were harassed really bad, and the kids were traumatized to the point where they would have like really bad reactions when they would approach the checkpoint. and the kids had to go, to counseling and things like that. So it's traumatizing. So that's where the term checkpoint trauma came from, because it's like, wow, this is a new thing. It's a new thing for us. A lot of people think like, oh, it's just normal now, but we have to remind ourselves it's not. Like, we didn't create this situation. And despite how much scrutiny the nation is under, I always remind people, well, the people that are crossing and the drugs that are crossing, like, their final destination isn't South Arizona. Their final destination is all these other places. So we're just a passing zone, and it's hard, because we have to remind, especially our leadership, who do support these grants and do support the presence of Border Patrol in the nation, and who give approval for right of ways and for all these projects that they want to do. A lot of times their attitude has been like, well, we've done it to ourselves. And I'm like, no, we didn't. And it's hard because it's so personal and literally close to home, that I think also not seeing it in that way is a sort of like protective and defense mechanism for a lot of O'odham. Because if you think about it in that way, and you're living there and you're living in it, it's hard, to realize like you're under surveillance, you're under occupation, and things aren't the way they are. Things aren't the way they used to be, and they're not going to be for a very long time unless something changes. And so I think it's just heartbreaking for a lot of people. And I think that's why a lot of people don't like to talk about it in that way. But also, I learned a lot from my students in their writings. Like, some of them wrote about their families or their homes being raided, watching their parents go through all of that. There was one young man who wrote about migrants and how he knew that when they came to his house for help, that he felt good, because he knew that they were helping people, but he also felt good because he knew that by helping them, that that meant that they would have food in their fridge, they would have electricity, and that he would have new shoes for school. And that was, through that business, we are helping each other like we always have. Just the way that people do it has changed, and why people do it has also changed a bit because of the money that's involved. Especially when we look at cases like Scott Warren's, where these humanitarian groups are able to help migrants, but also have a different support system than O'odham, who have basically helped them in the same way, but are criminalized for it. And a lot of people have lost their lives. A lot of people have lost their lives, like literally and figuratively. And I would share that because, with my family and my cousins and uncles and my dad, who got involved in trafficking, that it had an effect on our lives and my generation, because you have a whole generation of O'odham kids who didn't have their parents, because a lot of the parents were either got caught up in that lifestyle or went to prison. And that was the case with me, because my dad was in prison from the time I was in first grade to 8th grade. And that had a big effect on my family, and
was it for smuggling?
Yeah. And a lot of other families too, And so there is this big old wound, that the border basically created, not just literally on the land by dividing the people, but just by the different effects that it's had on the people on both sides of the line, and it's still rippling. And so like talking about these things and talking about it with our community, from the know your right stuff to like breaking down the history, questioning border patrol. So after that, we and I mean like other young O'odham, we created a collective that we called Thorn, because we wanted to be a thorn in the foot of authority, Tohono O'odham Rights Network, that came out of TOCC, or us that were attending TOCC at the time. But we started to question, and then it was cool to see the effect, because then the council started to have these community forums. But when the flyers started to come out for these community forums, it was, you see the seal of the Tohono O'odham Nation, and you see the seal of Border Patrol or Department of Homeland Security. So it was like that partnership against the people. It was cool because we would do our research. We would read resolutions, and we read Border Patrol strategies, and we would show up with like direct questions. And it was just pretty funny to see, like, a lot of times they had no words. Yeah, I think a lot of times they were surprised that we knew that much. And for me, going from doing that community work, of course, it led to bigger platforms. In 2017, I got invited. It was a lot of different trips, but I got invited to go to Palestine for 10 days. And I knew that the border technology, the surveillance technology, was an Israeli company, but I didn't know too much outside of that until we went there, and seeing for ourselves how similar their situation was to us. Meeting with the community members and them already knowing about us and knowing about our situation was really surprising to me. We're like across the world, and here this is something that connects us. It's this militarization, it's this surveillance technology, war technology that is being used to displace and erase, history of people, desert people too. Migration, movement across the land is nothing new. It's something that still exists. It's something that needs to exist because the land changes and we change. We're connected to the land through our food, through our water. And as the land changes, the people change. And we're seeing that now with climate change, right? That, there's forces beyond our control that force us to move along the land sometimes. I think also a lot of people don't realize that the laws are different around the border than the rest of the country. A lot of things are exempt, not just on the land, but for corporations, for mining, for all of these different things that are the reason why there's so much business, and whether that's legal or illegal. And I think a lot of the things that I've seen that I can share is that Border Patrol isn't a unified. They're not unified. They're not a unified command. Yes, they do have their strategies and stuff, but on the ground, even just with the Tohono O'odham Nation, there's 3 sectors of Border Patrol that patrol the Tohono O'odham Nation, and they don't communicate. They oftentimes don't know what each sector is doing or where they're at. There's a lot of infighting and things like that, and there's also a lot of corruption within Border Patrol. And those are like conversations I felt like I couldn't have when I was younger because I was too scared. But now I'm not scared to ask our community members, like, hey, what happened at that time? Or what happened to you? Or how did that go down? And seeing like, yeah, our speculations are true. But now the thing is, how do we document that? And how do how can we on our part do our part of sharing our stories and documenting like our part of how we see this part of history and what's happened. And one thing, and I don't like to think about it this way, but I see that it has to be this way for right now, is as far as the Tohono O'odham Nation, I see that part of why we're not as effective in keeping Border Patrol accountable is that we don't have anything in place right now. We depend on resolutions and MOUs that, are just basically something on paper, but there's not really an authority, there's not really an office, there's not really somebody or anybody that's out there actually keeping Border Patrol accountable to these agreements. And so what I see we would need to do, we have to do, is to create our own border policies that determine how anybody, operates on our land, whether it's Border Patrol, whether it's, outside companies or what have you. But what's happening now is that the enrollment, the Tohono O'odham Nation Enrollment Office is basically becoming a branch of the Department of Homeland Security, because in order to even produce those enhanced tribal IDs, the office needed to be outfitted like a federal office. And it also, again, like creates a divide and conquer tactic between O'odham and the U.S. and O'odham and Mexico, because O'odham and Mexico don't have access to those enhanced tribal IDs, so there's not anything that's helping them to move freely back and forth. It's only helping O'odham and the U.S. to move freely back and forth. And so it just creates like a bigger canyon of like, these privileges that, happen for O'odham on both sides of the line, and it just creates more division. And there's been a lot that's been happening these past couple of years as the border started to go up, the border wall, the reinforced border wall with Trump's administration. When they were doing the construction, they also unearthed a lot of ancestors and a lot of things that they probably wouldn't have found otherwise, which I think on our end reinforced our presence before the border was established. One of the biggest things are these, what they call them, geoglyphs, basically the big images that are on the land that you can see from above. So there's a whale that they found halfway between Quito Piquito and Yuma.
That they saw from the air, or were they unearthed from?
Yeah. After going through everything that I shared, and then coming back to, okay, we're now seeing this reinforced border wall, but literally, underneath it is again like our presence, like a reminder of our presence, our ancestors, are the marks that we've left, and to remind ourselves and to remind others that, we are speaking the truth and we are the truth, and there is a whole other truth beyond and before the border existed.